On air, online, on your smartphone, 2NURFM 103.7. Time to have a look at some of the things happening in the world of politics. We do that with our Professor of Politics from the University of Newcastle, Dr. Jim Jose. Now, I was kind of thinking, Jim, firstly, good morning. Haven't seen you for a while.
Yeah.
I was thinking, there's probably a zillion things to chat about, but if I was a betting man, I would have actually bet that Robodebt and the fallout from that, which we're seeing at the moment, would have been at the top of the list, and it certainly is. Some findings over the last week or so.
Yes, Mark. Unfortunately, it's a case study in how not to do policy, how not to implement a workable policy. There was, from what we've learnt from the Royal Commission, there were steps along the way where appropriate due diligence could and should have been applied, but there were particular outcomes desired. The minister had a particular thing in his sights. Scott Morrison at the time was the Minister for Social Services, and he wanted to show that they were coming down hard on welfare recipients, that they were going to root out all the cheats, etc. And in so doing, they would raise a significant amount of money for the budget, which would help offset some of the other budgeting issues. So it was all driven in part by perceived need to meet the minister's desire for a particular budget outcome. Unfortunately, as we've now learnt, that desire overrode pretty well everything. And unfortunately, Mark, that's one of the big lessons in this process, that in the process of government, if the minister subordinates the advisors from, that's to say, the public service machinery, that is to give effect to government policy and translate the minister's wish into something that is appropriate, that will deliver it, then the public servants themselves need to have sufficient courage and backbone to ensure that the minister is given appropriate advice, not just simply what the minister might want to hear, but advice that enables the minister to put the proposal forward that rests on firm ground. And the ground that the Robodebt machinery, the new policy as they called it, the new policy proposal, did not take account of the fact that under the Social Services Act, income averaging over a year was not appropriate. In fact, not appropriate is the wrong word, Mark. It was not legal.
Not legal.
There was no legal basis for it.
And that just seems a pretty basic thing to check out. Hey, we're going to put this thing in. Is there anything in the rules that say we can't do this? That would have taken, essentially a couple of minutes. Now, I guess and a horrible scam. I don't think anybody, looking back on it now, thinks it was a good idea. I mean, you can just imagine you go to your bank account and all of a sudden you're very much overdrawn. What's this? The government's taken my money. It's the guilt before innocence thing. Also think are a lot of people that were sort of had their hands on this scheme all the way through. I mean, while the roulette wheel of life stopped at Scott Morrison, and I'm going to use my favourite line, Jim, there's nothing that galvanises the left and right together as their hatred of Scott Morrison. But it goes back even further. I mean, some of the people we're seeing out now, the Bill Shortens, the Tanya Plibersek, all along the way had a part of it. But you actually want to go back even further than that on the way that the whole the changing, I guess, of what became Centrelink.
Well, part of the problem has been historically a demonisation of people who are in receipt of welfare benefits. And we can go way, way back to Federation, if you like, to have that dichotomy between the deserving and the undeserving poor. We punish the undeserving poor, so-called, and we tolerate the deserving poor. Now, that sort of dichotomy has been framing thinking around policy and social security and social services for a long, long time. But the demonisation of the unemployed in a big way sort of begins with Clyde Cameron in the Whitlam ministry, in the Whitlam government in the 70s. And I think that's when the term dole bludger first begins to get currency.
So you reckon even back that far was what the modern, visualisation of that concept?
The demonisation process. Now, so when we get to 2000, in the 2010s, this is all par for the course, that it's okay to beat up on people in receipt of benefits because they're cheating the system. Now, contrary to the popular imagination, it's around about 1% of the social security budget, of the welfare budget side of things, is what you might call being rorted. It's a very, very small percentage of people involved. And unfortunately, we outside of government processes get the opposite picture. So that's one of the sort of issues that drove or pushed through with Robodebt. The other dimension that is also worth mentioning, because it was, I think Bill Shorten this week or yesterday came out and said something about Labor doesn't demonise, welfare benefits. Well, historically we've seen that that's absolutely not the case. They have had their share of demonising people on welfare. The other thing that's worth just noting very quickly, Mark, is the opposition leader, Mr Dutton, talking about people are innocent until proven guilty. Now, that might be so in a court of law, but when we look at what the Robodebt Royal Commission has uncovered and the evidence it's considered, it has basically not publicly named names yet, but it has identified a number of people who do have responsibility and need to be perhaps called to account in some way. They're not in Peter Dutton's legalese terms. They're innocent in terms of going before a criminal court and all that, but in terms of their participation and level of responsibility and their role in the whole Robodebt process, they are not innocent. They are part of the process, and they can't sort of be cordoned off as if, well, they didn't really know what was going on, therefore we can't treat them as responsible. That's totally not the case. I guess politics being politics, that ex-ministers, I should say, will say, well, we didn't actually know what was going on. I relied on my advisor, my public servant secretary, or whatever it happens to be.
The best advice at the time, all of that. Yeah.
And I was just misled. Unfortunately, what the Royal Commissioner has found in weighing up the evidence and that was put before it, that all of the ministers involved, that's to say the 3 ministers for Social Security, had more than a passing idea of what was actually going on, and not one sought to question what is the legal basis for this. Secondly, they were very much aware that if they did have to make a legislative change, that is to say put legislation through to give it a secure legal basis, it wouldn't get through the Senate and it would fail. So they needed to bypass that. That was one of the big drivers as well. How do we get around the political machinery that might actually prevent us from realising this particular policy proposal? Unfortunately, in doing that, they breached just about every key ethical guideline that public servants are supposed to abide by. And this wasn't sort of at a low level, Mark. This is why it's such a shocking process, or a shocking incident, that this was at the most senior levels of particular public service departments, and from the minister down through to the secretary and the very top layer, the senior executive service of the public service. So the fallout from this is going on for a long time. Hopefully there will be lessons learned, but at the moment it seems to me politically both sides of the parliamentary divide, the coalition and the Labor Party, are doing their best to sort of downplay their own involvement in the process. And yes, true, the Labor Party, Labor members can say, hey, we had no part of Robodebt. Well, no, but there's a bigger context, and that context needs to be kept firmly in mind, that successive ministers of the social services on both sides of the parliamentary divide have perhaps been less than charitable when it's come to dealing with the unemployed, but by engaging in demonisation of people on welfare benefits.
Hold that whole topic as a thing, Jim. We want to do that in its whole entirety another time, because I think there's something to tap into the psyche of how politics happens, and when we'll look at that whole 1% of inverted commas rorting another time. But anyway, the Robodebt stuff, we will certainly have the popcorn ready, because that's not going away anytime soon. Jim, thank you for your time. We'll talk to you next time around.
My pleasure, Mark. Thank you.
There he is, our Professor of Politics from the University of Newcastle, Dr. Jim Jose, on 2NURFM.
A broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.